Hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on creative industries. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will introduce you to the idea of creative industry. As you know that the term creative industry emerged from policy deliberations to subsequent academic engagement in understanding its implications, scope and criticism, along with the rise of post-industrial economy in developed societies. The post-industrial economy witnessed the rise of labor force and employment in the cultural sector. Second, it registered the importance of cultural sector to the contribution of national wealth. And finally, it recognized the shift of art and culture from patronage and subsidy to creativity. In spite of a significant trajectory and progress, the concept is free from interrogation and contestation. In this lecture, we will discuss the importance of the term, its implications, and outline its scope and relevance. The outcome of this lecture is to give you a clarity about the concept, its emergence and importance of creative industry, a notion of creative industry and its core functioning through the various models advocated by scholars. From this lecture, you will be able to understand how the usage and attributes of culture could be employed in the post-industrial economy as a whole to address the new conditions of production and consumption in the creative industry. Now, how do we problematize the term creative industry? As we understand, the idea of creative industry that emerged from policy deliberations and subsequently it rose to political agenda in Great Britain in 1990s and circulated globally as another form of industrialization process. Although the term has reached the length and breadth of other parts of the world, yet it is not free from complications while linking culture with economy as documented by scholars. Broadly, we come across two strands are visible in such discussions. The former refers to the vagueness and skepticism due to the uncritical acceptance of economic policies. On the contrary, the other strand opens up a handful of promises propounded by marketing agencies, management gurus, advertising agencies, artists and activists. Followers of this strand advocate the need for innovation and creativity that needs to be the primary focus in the national development strategies. The idea of creative economy is based on the foundation of this principle. It also adds traction by incorporating value, exports, and new job opportunities and competitiveness. The idea of innovation and creativity are the mantras of creative industry. This is also popularized and endorsed by international agencies such as UNDP and other leading agencies like OECD, WTO, World Bank. So policymakers across the world are stressing the need and importance of innovation, creativity and independent thinking as a crucial input for global economy. One of the significant challenges posed by creative industry is it questions the linear innovation process and conventional forms of technological development through R&D, that is research and development investment. The advocates of the creative industry question the unilinear perspective of thinking and knowledge accumulation, which has not generated much participation from the supply side. Instead, it wants to understand the process as complex mechanism that involves knowledge accumulation and continuous innovation. Hence, the need arises to understand the cultural dynamics of dissemination of knowledge and how they are significant. The idea of creativity has become a buzzword ever since 1990s, and accordingly, new terms have been coined and industries have been formulated. Terms such as copyright industries, content industries, art-centric business, cultural and communication industries, experience economy, creative business sector, media industries, and knowledge economies, and finally, aesthetic economy are in circulation. These nomenclatures have raised eyebrows as regard the process of industrialization and economy. Besides, the terminological confusion has raised suspicion as well as expanded the horizon of innovation to non-technological sectors of production. The idea of innovation becomes a matter of interpretation. As we discussed earlier, there are tremendous semantic and conceptual confusion that leads scholars to disagreement as regard the term creative and cultural industries. The idea of creative industry encompasses varieties of segments and an element of fluidity in defining the term as it varies from project to project across nations. There is a problem of standard set of parameters for any general or comparative analysis across societies, in particular as informed by Throsby. Besides scope and categories, scholars highlight theoretical and normative differences. A vast range of research studies have been undertaken on the concept of creative industries, and the use of the term creative industry also allows for the inclusion of old as well as new spheres such as theatre, drama, and new media. Further, functional definition of cultural services and goods are added to the definition as outlined by Throsby. Scholars try to incorporate specifically the activities whose production involved some sort of creativity and also are concerned with the communication of symbolic meaning and symbolize some kind of intellectual dealings. The concept of creative industry can be at best understood with the help of some models proposed by scholars time and again. The definition given by Throsby aligns with other principal models of creative industry given by Skimp and Serida, some of these scholars, and even Hicks and Cunningham, then Murchison, providing a broader basis for discussion. For understanding the creative industries, David Throsby offers a conventional concentric circle model. As per this model, culture is looked upon as the basis of all the creative industries based on the cultural ethos. What it implies is that the more distinct the cultural content of a particular service or a good, the studier is the entitlement of insertion in the creative industry producing it. As reported or informed by United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which illustrates that the emphasis of Throsby's model is that creative ideas generally initiate in the core and these ideas diffuse towards through a sequence of layers or concentric circles. As mentioned above, the central point is considered to be the source of creative ideas and gradually radiating outwards as and when the ideas combine with other outputs and produce a larger range of creative products. This elaborative model offers a convenient way of representing the existing industries and the work environments that we intend to explore and examine. Throsby further explains that the cultural content of creative industries is presumed to decline when one moves away from through the concentric circles. In this context, several scholars have noted that this assumption about the cultural value is quite tricky and needs to be examined. Throsby's model is based on the notion that art is purely creative as it is not commercialized and is considered a little hierarchical. Further, this model fails to provide any explanation about the work conditions of the creative labor engaged in the creative industries. It also does not consider the creativity of fashion and design by labeling them to be as industrial. Interestingly, the concentric circle model also offers the foundation for examining the diverse courses of development that are given emphasis in terms of commercial value, reproducibility, and production scale. Here, our central argument is that to do so, one needs to move beyond the practical assumptions of creativity flowing outwards in the concentric circle model for examining how diverse industries are organized and administer their labor and commodification processes. Let us elaborate this point. Through one example, like for instance, Throsby's model considers film and recorded music in separate fields. Although these two industries have resemblances as far as their organizational structure and logic of commodification is concerned, that associate them with elements of the print and publication, yet make them different from other industries within the broader cultural industries. Some scholars also point out other differences in terms of the scope of management's interference, which is numerous within the music industry, value chain than that of the film industry. The definitions on creativity do not remain confined to the creative industry only, but also extends to the idea of creative workers as well. While analyzing literature on the labor process, we observe that work in every sector contains some amount of creativity. And additionally, the use of creativity solely as a central feature is not enough to tell about the nature of work. In this context, Thompson and colleagues noted that whatever work done by and with creative labor actually matters. It is interesting to note here that creative work, as it is perceived to be innovative, non-repeatable, newly imagined, and non-standard, is quite rare, and most labor has its own routine and familiar element. Here it is argued by Capes that there is a larger entirety in the productive course of creative industry, and the workers are involved in both theoretical as well as operational processes. What we derive from the above discussion is that in both the functioning and atmosphere of creative industries work, both inspired and the mundane entities will exist, and moreover, not all workers of creative industries will undertake work every time that is accepted as equally creative. One of the significant yet overlooked factors is the balance between recognized creative labor and skilled craft of practitioners. The experience of such artistic practitioners in the creative industries struggles between creative purpose in one hand and economic purpose or financial gain on the other. Therefore, our argument, while emphasizing the difficulty of defining work in terms of creative content, is that for certain parts where market is unstable and predictable, chances of perishability of products is higher, and in comparatively new markets, it is difficult to standardize the act of creativity in production. The innovation in creative labor can come to define a whole zone of work. It is interesting to see how divisions are made between different types of workers, and it reveals not only the forms of self-identification and industry practices, but also highlights the shifts within the broader social evaluation, including cultural policies. Throsby advocated one significant approach by identifying a creative trident that comprises specialist workers, those engaged in co-creative works within creative industries, support workers, those engaged in occupations other than core works within the creative industries, embedded workers, those engaged in co-creative works within other industries, or even most of the discussions in Australia concerning creative industrial revolve around employment and economic contribution in the sector, and also about the lack of definitional agreement that possibly may obstruct efforts at quantification. As per the Australian census data, the creative industry sector employs more than 315,000 people. That equals around 3.5% of the total Australian workforce, and out of the total approximately 1,41,18,800 are specialist creative workers. The Australian census data indicate that the most of the creative industry business are relatively small business or only comprise sole traders. Though this has effects for work and employment forms, the importance of the organizational construction of the creative industries for the dynamics of work and employment becomes more deceptive once the participation of a range of organizations is studied, such as small and medium-sized initiatives. Large organizations within the creative industries and outside of it. Hearn provides an alternative to Throsby's concentric circles model that distinguishes between sectors within the creative industries as a whole by developing the conception of value-creating ecology within the industry. The idea of value-creating ecology has been developed as an enhancement on supply chain in firms where workflow is multidirectional. Some research studies are critical of notions of knowledge, economics, and the supremacy of flows of information, and suggest that each sector has its own organizational framework as well as developmental logic. Besides Throsby's concentric circle model, there are other significant models that too provide insights about creative industries. As you can see in figure on screen, that is the KEA model that distinguishes between the core arts, cultural industries and creative industries. And this model is based on 2006 European Commission report. Such distinction between the arts and the cultural industries is basically concerned with the use of copyright or intellectual property. One of the main arguments offered by this model is that how does one exclude design, architecture and advertising conceptually from the cultural as they have been historically part of it. This model excludes them on the basis that they are not arts. Even this model does not give any concrete definitive criteria for creative industries and how are they arranged. The Work Foundations in the year 2007 has proposed a model which draws its conclusions from Throsby's model. It includes the creative core, which includes all forms of creative products, both the arts and the digital. First comes the cultural industries, which include the conventional industries like television, films, radio, music industries, etc. Then the creative industries, which have been certain functionality, architecture for buildings, advertising for selling products, designs for various sectors of production, etc. Beyond these, there are wider parts of the economy which uses creativity as one form or another. The model started with the pure creative inputs and then moves outwards towards functionality of the creative. The more functionality it has, the more it is the outer ring. This model uses the term expressiveness for creativity. It does so that the inherent qualities of culture is enlarged and can encompass more and more industries into it. Further, scholars come up with a symbolic text model. Europe has a rich critical cultural tradition, and this model is a direct result of the same. This model is particularly interested with the popular culture and the processes by which the culture of a society is formed and transmitted using the industrial production, dissemination and consumption of symbolic texts or messages. These messages are disseminated using various media such as print, publication, broadcasting technology, audiovisual medium, etc. Here we observe that the concentration in this model is very much in the media and its usage in the creative sector. But even this model cannot explain effects the cultural texts and the industries have. The emphasis on cultural texts translates directly into emphasis being given on the media. The model leaves out the arts, which also makes it bereaved of aesthetic debates. And in a way, it also leaves out the larger implications of creative industries while getting too much engrossed in symbolic texts. What we gather from the above discussions is that the models make an attempt to classify the cultural industries either on the basis of intellectual property rights, on the basis of the cultural elements like aesthetics, text, etc., on the basis of functionality, etc. But none of them can explain the idea of creative industry itself. To encompass and explain the function of artistic, creative and immaterial, the traditional approach to look into creativity and cultural industries will not work. Scholars have argued that a very different approach might be taken to address it, which is vis-a-vis innovation. Creative industry is not simply an industry per se, but it is an overall process. Creative industry as a nomenclature does not have a specific taxonomy. In the neoliberal economy, where innovation, creativity have become processes, competitive edge, there cannot be clear demarcation between the sectors. There is a clear case of overlap, and looking for definite sectors in the creative sectors is a futile exercise. What one can do is that take different vantage points like cultural, texts, intellectual property, etc., and try to understand its workings. The creative processes of any industry are defined by UNESCO as those stressing the production and circulation of substantial cultural content. The issue of copyright is also involved in the entire production process of creative industry. Like, for instance, a number of cultural contents shaped and produced through ideation involve intellectual property rights. The Organization of World Intellectual Property Rights considers such issues from the viewpoint of copyrights industries. United Nations Conference on Trade and Development chiefly considers trade as the motivation factor of the creative economy, in particular highlighting the potential for development in the creative sector of developing nations. While concluding, I would like to say that our presentation or the lecture discussed about how the concept of creative industries evolved primarily from the cultural industries post the industrialized economy that witnessed the growth of labor and employment force. The permeation of the economy by cultural production forms has called for new kinds of, or which is difficult to manage, skills and business models previously restricted to the cultural industries. Indeed, the term creative industries expresses this as generalized creativity. Creative industry is a response to the post-industrial society when newer modes of production and consumption emerged. What we also learned from this module is that creative industry per se is difficult to define and categorize. Different scholars have adopted different ways to do so, adopting different initiating points. What is interesting to observe is that creative industry is not subjected to academic inquiry alone. The different policy-making bodies of the West, both national and international, try to engage with it, considering it to be a viable option to address the changing patterns of the economy, market and labor. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.